I became aware of Pieces Interactive's Alone in the Dark reboot during the production of my Alone in the Dark Complete Retrospective. What little information we had at that time did not thrill me. Turned off by the generic horror visuals of possessed children's dolls and bland looking gameplay, I had no hope for this fourth attempt of reimagining a cult classic. Despite my slander, THQ Nordic's marketing team still reached out, providing a review code for their newest release. Were they proud of their developers' achievements and wanting to prove me wrong, or did they not watch the video and simply sent a code to a channel with one of the higher viewed Alone in the Dark videos? It's most definitely the latter. Still, the hubris in offering myself a code piqued my interest. A divisive game with critics, AITD24 appears to be a hate it or like it kind of game. Frankly, much of this hate I believe to be unfounded, based on unfair expectations and comparisons with other games that it does not seem to be interested in competing with. That's not to say the game is a masterpiece. Personally, I place it at a slightly above average 6 out of 10, with that score being dragged down to a 5 due to performance issues and bugs that have since been mostly rectified. The reason for outright announcing my review score so early is that this video will, in some areas, come across as a defense of the game. I believe many of the poor reviews miss the point, overlook the developer's intentions, or are blind to the palpable love and care Pieces Interactive have for the source material. I didn't think I would be saying this earlier this year, but Alone in the Dark 2024 is kinda good.
Jwlar.
It isn't a remake like Capcom's revivals, but a complete reimagining of the original, providing a whole new take on the plot and gameplay with a product more fitting of a release date 30 years later. Being the first time that I had received a game code from a large publisher, my time as a quote-unquote early access reviewer was a learning experience, and I wasn't too keen on what I discovered. The code was sent a mere 8 hours before the game's release. I'm not complaining about a free game, certainly not one as highly priced as this. However, it did lead me to wonder if this was the usual time frame reviewers are given to form their impressions. It's no secret that timeliness is key in scoring the maximum number of hits when releasing a review, whether in print or on YouTube. Do marketers perhaps expect us to gather our first impressions as quickly as we can so as to release a day one video in hopes of higher views? It may just have been a mistake, as the marketing manager admitted, and I'll admit that more popular channels and review sites may have been given the code earlier, yet I couldn't help but feel going into the game that first impressions may be good, and it is in the later chapters where reviewers may not have had a chance to fully check the game where issues would appear. With the utter failure that was Alone in the Dark Illumination, the poor reception it deserved led to Atari SA selling the franchise to THQ Nordic. Having held the rights since AITD's inception, back when the publisher was known as Infogrames, Atari SA had proven themselves incompetent with the series even as early as the second game in some opinions. Under THQ Nordic, Pieces Interactive was handed the keys to the kingdom. Best known for the lackluster sequel to action-adventure game Magica, they may not have been the ideal candidates to champion the reboot based on their portfolio. With the financial backing of THQ, and some choice hires such as Mikhail Hedberg, writer of Sungma and Amnesia: The Dark Descent, as well as artist Guy Davis, famous for his work with Guillermo del Toro, the development team quickly grew to accommodate their new mantle. Immediately upon hitting new game, Alone in the Dark wears its homage to the 1992 game on its sleeve, with a lovely close-up of a Louisiana frog. Homage is the best description of the game as a whole. For fans of the original trilogy, the fan service will be clear throughout. Fan service has become a bit of a dirty word in recent media discourse, but it doesn't have to be. This isn't a case of throwing in member berries so as to evoke soy jack reactions. The respects they pay to Frederic Renal's creation vary from noble tributes to interesting new takes on elements from the previous games, building on and morphing the lore to fit their new narrative without feeling derivative or forced. The admiration for the 1992 game can be seen no further than inviting Renal to play and give his approval of the game, having him sit down to provide his impressions as part of the director's commentary, where he himself maintains that AITD 24 has kept the core feeling of the original.
Hello everyone, I'm Frederic Renal, the creator of the first Alone in the Dark in 1992, and I'm so delighted to see again Derceto, and especially in this new state.
Among the homages, new elements are slotted in between. In the opening cutscene, this being the two Hollywood actors that Pieces Interactive are clearly proud to place front and center, going as far as to give the actors' names as subtitles to the characters on the selection screen. As a reimagining of the first game, there's not much reference to 2001's The New Nightmare, nor the bombastic 2008 reboot. To this end, some may be disgruntled to find that the choice of two characters does not fundamentally alter the campaign a la Resident Evil 2, instead acting closer to a stripped back New Game Plus of sorts, providing an alternate angle of the story without completely changing the campaign. Just as I'm editing this review, Pieces Interactive released a new patch without any patch notes. Loading up the game, I found that they've actually debuted a real New Game Plus, with all the bells and whistles expected from that mode. Throughout this story, the player will find themselves encountering all the survival horror staples that its namesake put in place. Limited resources and health items, combat against ghastly beasts, puzzles built on finding unique items around the environment, exploring locations to discover their secrets, and advance to drama through strewn around notes and books. The game is competent enough in these factors, even if some are lacking by the standards of the genre in current year. While I do enjoy AITD24 for what it is, its most glaring problems lead me to the technical state of the game, and it would be remiss not to mention them. The leading issue on release was noticeable stutters whenever new assets were loaded in. This would be during cutscenes, when transitioning between rooms, or even when turning around. It's an Unreal Engine 4 staple, and the reason why many games on that engine require a shader pre-compilation step before starting the game. This launched without that, resulting in stuttering even on high-end hardware, frustrating players across the board. They're typically minor, dropping to a single FPS for just a second, but the frequency of their occurrence is what made it so annoying, especially as many games on the same engine had learned to minimize the issue with that pre-compilation step. A month after release, these stutters were corrected with some additional settings, and I found that turning on the HDD loading, even though I ran the game off of an NVMe SSD, helped further in minimizing the stutter. Then there are, or were, the bugs. Most of these have since been patched, but we shouldn't ignore that the game was released with them, even if it won't be valid for future prospective buyers. And it all comes down to those quality control issues I was worried about when I received the code so late. In Chapter 4, around 6 hours into a non-rushed steady playthrough, enemy animations began to break, and odd bugs such as enemies requiring an obscene amount of damage to pot down started to crop up, seemingly at random. There are certain pieces of the terrain that the character model can get stuck on as well. It only happened to me once, and I was fortunate enough to be able to wiggle free. Others pointed it out as happening far more frequently in earlier builds, and even forcing a reload in some instances. The worst quality control bug has to be a broken puzzle in Chapter 2 that would soft lock the game. I can't prove that the late timing of the review code was in hopes of hiding these issues, but it didn't give me high hopes. Regardless, they have since been mostly rectified, so let's get started. Jeremy Hartwood, uncle of Emily Hartwood, has sent a worrying letter to his niece, forcing her to go visit him in hopes of calming him down and understanding why he is being so frantic. Not that this is a surprise to the young woman. A so-called curse of madness and insanity has pervaded her family for generations. In her employ is private detective Edward Comby, hired to aid her in questioning Jeremy and discovering if there is any truth to his lunacy. This task brings them to the Seto Manor, a former plantation household since renovated into a psychiatric hospital for the mentally fatigued, overlooked by Dr. Gray. Traveling through the Louisiana bayou, the duo find themselves locked out and forced to find their way in. Already, the plot deviates from the original, where Jeremy is not yet dead. Indeed, other than references to and similar themes as that story, AITD24's narrative plays out very differently, but its Easter eggs for original fans are so tastily done that having a working knowledge of the 1992 game will actually improve the player's insights into some of the characters and lore revealed within. Many of these references were originally pulled straight from Lovecraft, resulting in a meta-narrative of references to both source materials as this game tells its own unique fable using them. Thanks to his profession, Combi is armed with a 6-shot revolver, and what could be put down to her Second Amendment right, Emily carries a semi-automatic pistol, seemingly a Steel Colt 1911 or something similar. Both brandish their weapon of choice as they sneak into the garage, searching for a way into the Deseto institution. Deseto's place in the gameplay is completely disconnected from how it was utilised in 1992, and part of that I suspect is the reason why some older fans may bounce off of AITD24, due to the expectation of Deseto to be a haunted house. Evil does pervade these hallways, but not in the way it once did. The house exists as a zone for exploration, puzzle solving, lore finding and storytelling, at first at least, while the outside world is where the faster paced gameplay occurs, your combat, stealth and such. These locations are Jeremy's world. We first enter the haunted domain through the demented eyes of a self-portrait, and from there our spiral into the depths of this tormented soul begins. We'll get more into that when we cover the story, but for now our hero is trying to break and enter their way in. Visually, it's a mixed bag, but I'll say for the most part, it's what one can expect from a 2020s game built in the Unreal Engine, remembering of course that this is a AA game built by 40 people, not a massive first-party effort. Nothing stands out as ugly, but you aren't going to be calling this a groundbreaking graphical achievement either. Stunning set pieces and a liberal use of graphically intensive, yet admittedly beautiful lighting effects offer moments of beauty, but these can be few and far between. As is often the case, this is another port of a console game that hasn't had the full PC treatment, notably in the user interface department. Despite that, I was happily surprised to find that the video options actually look pretty good across the board, with DLSS and FSR 2.0 available to help push frame rates, as well as multiple FPS caps, an FOV slider, and the expected assortment of technical tweaks to help dial in performance. I haven't played the game on console, so I can't speak for the frame consistency over there. Having looked at gameplay videos online, it does seem to be using the higher end of the settings. Seeing as my 2080 Ti is looking a little long in the tooth when it comes to the latest releases nowadays, and with the third person over the shoulder perspective, I felt that a 60 FPS limit was adequate to maintain fidelity while playing on high settings. I did find that for some reason, even when completely turned off, there is still motion blur when moving the camera quickly. I'm not one to be especially sensitive to blurring, but it's still noticeable to me as of the April 22nd patch. I also tested this with DLS turned off, which can result in a similar effect. To be expected from an over-the-shoulder first-person camera, there is the standard jerkiness as a result of the camera hitting objects out of frame. I minimized this by lowering the field of view to just above the default value, which only helps the claustrophobia and exploration in my opinion, given a closer view of the crafted world. The unscalable console HUD is pretty big and carries the hallmarks of a design set around a directional pad. And there's the all too standard case of the tutorial hotkeys not updating if they have been rebound, which can make the tutorial section a little bit confusing. After starting a new game, I noticed that the keys did update, so if you would like to remap your controls, do so before starting. Following in the footsteps of God of War, Until Dawn and Death Stranding, motion capturing famous figures for video games is a trend that has elevated games both in public acknowledgement and in how they tell their stories. Certainly where emotional storytelling requires a highly trained professional performer to achieve greatly impassioned scenes. David Harbour's and Jodie Comer's roles don't necessarily aid the plot to any meaningful degree, barring the higher quality of the motion captured animations. Their performances aren't bad. Some reviews highlighted that Harbour came across as bored, but having viewed much of his material beforehand, his demeanour here doesn't appear any different to any other role. The issue for me is that other than looking good on marketing material to a new audience, Comer and Harbour aren't given the hard-hitting scenes that highlighted why the likes of Norman Reedus or Christopher Judge may be better suited for high-stakes character-driven drama than just a well-established voice actor. It's that motion capture animation that stands out the most, as the quality dominates any scene where the actors must perform across from digital models that do not share the same level of facial intricacies, forming a visual rift between the main characters and the various NPCs we encounter. Now these NPCs don't look horrible. I've seen hyperbolic remarks that it's as if they've been pulled out of a 7th generation game. I wouldn't go that far, yet a difference can be seen if one is looking for it. Past those technical aspects, Alone in the Dark's art style is what stands out. Of course, it's maintaining general photorealism, for the times you're in the manner at least, but draped over that are the influences of 1920s film noir, as well as the Art Deco styling associated with the time period. Outfits are period accurate, falling into the stereotypes you would expect. The disheveled detective, clean and proper working lady, flappers, maids, labourers, and so on. This too continues into the presentation. Camera angles and cutscene direction seem to take influence from murder mysteries and detective movies of the time, and character archetypes as well as the writing maintains its authenticity. The noir artistic direction is new to this remake, but it doesn't clash with the cosmic Lovecraftian style horror set pieces. Seeing as contemporary viewpoints tend to merge various art styles of a time period together as we take an overarching view of the past, Alone in the Dark screams 1920s without feeling incongruous in how it meshes its inspirations, even if this combination may have felt odd for the actual time period. A further example of this is the recurrent use of jazz within the soundtrack. Jazz isn't really linked with film noir or Lovecraft, so one could assume that its use is due to the game's time period and not much else. While valid as a reasoning, it would be callous to conclude that there isn't a deeper meaning, a meaning I believe to be linked with when the jazz is used. Jazz isn't the only kind of music on offer. The staple horror music you find in a recent Resident Evil or other survival horror title can be heard just as often, if not more often, depending on how you play the game. Jazz exists here to essentially split the game. For better or worse, it's a story of two worlds intertwining. The banal normality of reality and the twisted otherworldliness of insanity. A point of contention among quite a few user reviews asserts similar messages to how jazz isn't scary. That's largely true, but they're missing the point of its use. It's not meant to be scary. Atmosphere relies on music and sound design as much, if not more than, visuals. As a deliberate choice then, our time in Deseto, unlike in AITD 92, is meant to alleviate fear, not cause it. That sounds like blasphemy? Remember that this is a reboot. While it was a shock, I don't think this change hurts the game in retrospect, but it for sure requires an open mind. Deseto isn't a manor inhabited by great evil, not on the surface at least. It's a home of the mentally unwell and those society deemed unacceptable. Not is all that it seems, and much will change as the storyline progresses, but for a lot of the game, Deseto is a safe space, a place of levity even if darkness does linger. Here, in the daytime, often accompanied by a resident, the jazz plays. This is a peaceful area for puzzle solving and reading up on the background lore to help support the narrative. Accordingly, the freeform, inherently creative, while often chaotic nature of jazz supports these gameplay functions well. Jeremy's world then, set outside and focusing on action, are the dangerous spaces. Here, the traditionally expected soundtrack plays. As more goes wrong and that safe space of old is flipping on its head, the two soundtracks, safe jazz and that unsafe big band brass heavy horror music, clash together, until the jazz music is no longer your friend. For each time it makes you think you're in safety, without warning you could find yourself pulled back into danger, essentially Pavloving the player with its sound design. Helped further by some really cool scene transitions from the house to the exteriors. You often won't know when it's going to happen, evoking Renal's original concept of keeping the player on the edge of their seat.
In an adventure game, you walk 80% of the time. If you want to put big pressure on the player, just scare him on what he does all the time. Just walking.
It really feels like a brand new take on that pitch, where we never know when it will go wrong. AITD 92 achieved this by killing the player unfairly. AITD 24 does it by using its atmosphere to lie and set false expectations. Where some may have pause is with how Carnby has been reimagined through the noir lens. True enough, I too made those same critiques about the character's arc in the 90s trilogy. When we first met Edward in 1992, he was your typical Lovecraftian protagonist, unassuming, unprepared, and by no means heroic in the traditional sense. He was a thin, mustachioed, tweed-wearing private investigator, whose only association with the suave figures on the silver screen is that they shared a similar job title. Infogrames knew that he wasn't a badass, which is why they gave him a clean shave, a snazzier outfit, and a beefier physique for his pirate and cowboy fighting escapades in the sequels. Similarly, Pieces Interactive have designed their take on Combi to reflect the more stereotypical approach to a hero. Typecasted by his performance in Stranger Things as Chief of Police Jim Hopper, Pieces wrote Harbor's iteration of Combi to follow classic tropes of a detective, such as a gruff attitude with wit and a sense of humor, traits that are the polar opposite of his comparatively underdeveloped character in the first game. Creative director Mikhail Hedberg admitted that they deemed the change necessary due to the original Combi's position as a reluctant hero, his scholarly fragile luck making him appear too uninteresting compared to Emily, who has greater stakes with the story. To level the playing field, they took closer inspiration from his performance in Alone in the Dark 3. This doesn't hurt the game though. The humble, out-of-his-depth professor of 1992 may have worked just as well, but with the new film noir themes, Harbor's take on the character fits the setting like a glove. As for the cutscenes, the game takes away control fairly often, with cinematics used as one of the key tenets of the game's storytelling. While it did happen more often than I first expected, the removal of control wasn't frequent enough to agitate me, nor did the cutscenes overstay their welcome, providing just enough information to keep the plot moving, with the extra superfluous fluff placed into notes, clues, and optional dialogue. Those notes, as with the original, are not as optional as that dialogue. Not only do they contain necessary tips for the puzzles, but the lore contained within is required to fully grasp the story. Following in the footsteps of the CD version of AITD 92, they are fully voice acted, and thankfully the actors and vocal direction are of a higher quality, adding to the game's atmosphere without cutting through any tension with overly campy performances.
One admits to being somewhat flabbergasted.
They aren't overly serious either. It's admittedly hard to make some Lovecraftian references sound terrifying when spoken out loud, but the attempts are at least commendable.
Because their own bodies are afraid and they wish to repel the evil those words conjure. Iya! Iya!
Certainly compared to what we've had before.
Katulufatang! Aya! Aya!
Importantly, I'm glad to say that the voice acting can be paused. I find it difficult to read ahead if there's a voice actor reading at the same time. Not that you would want to skip them with the quality of the performance, but if you do want to skim read or return to a note later, it's nice to not be stricken with the same voice lines every time. The voice acting for the Deseto residents is great too.
Emily, is that you?
You're still working at Deseto?
Yeah, both me and Lotta stuck around. We're real orderlies now. You remember my sister Lotta, don't you?
The animation and lip syncing may not be perfect, not even on the motion captured Combi or hardware at times, but it's more than good enough and not noticeable unless you're looking out for it. A point that I will agree with some reviews is the lack of reaction lines from the playable characters. What few do play amounts to generic lines saying "aha" or "yes, got it." They seem a bit nonplussed, leading me to believe that at the time of recording, the devs were not entirely sure on where the lines would actually be placed in-game, and simply asked Como and Harbor to record them as a just-in-case. Giving the game a better sense of place is how we finally get to see Louisiana. We knew that this is where Deseto was based on the books in the original, but we never got a sense of how that affected world building. Pieces have leaned into the southern aesthetic strongly, walking the streets of New Orleans, the swamps of the bayou, or traversing an abandoned steamboat. Choosing to build upon these murky locations to emphasize their inherent creepy nature was a no-brainer that Rockstar 2 realized with RDR2. What I was most thankful for is how they haven't leaned into the schlocky horror that we first saw in the reveal trailers. It's still there in places, like a hospital bed inexplicably hanging from the ceiling of a stairwell. A big deal is never made about it though. They aren't forcing us to fear imagery that has become second nature for the genre. Which leads us to the strongest negative opinion shown in reviews, that the game isn't scary. That's always going to be a subjective matter, one dependent heavily on your past experiences and numbness to horror standards that AITD24 does at times adhere to, while also trying to subvert it in places. This isn't helped by the enemy designs. Guy Davis's time with Guillermo del Toro is distinctly evident. These slow shuffling Grey Romero-esque zombies of old have been reimagined as bags of flesh held together by vines, permeating that grisly swamp aesthetic which I like a lot, but the other beasties can't help but feel generic. Blind enemies made of multiple torsos, and mud-dwelling eel-like abominations don't elicit disgust or fear so much past their implicit gameplay danger. Except for some boss battles, it's hard to place these designs as cosmic or unexplainable as Lovecraftian beasts often are, although the same can of course be said of the early fodder from AITD 92. While we don't have abstract door stingers returning, as the evil that infests Deseto grows stronger, we do get a glimpse at some greater horrors in the game's climax. This isn't Resi Evil, aiming to disgust us with gross body horror, or Amnesia forcing us to hide and run for our lives on multiple occasions. AITD24 relies on its atmosphere and uncertainty to keep up tension. It's an odd one because while Alone in the Dark was the birth of survival horror, as I said in that retrospective, it wasn't necessarily horrifying. To younger players it certainly was, being that that was the age range the majority of those that found it scary at the time would have been, and the same could be said of the newest release if an 11-year-old found themselves playing it. Yet for horror addicts, I can see why AITD24 isn't causing any new nightmares. Its atmosphere is largely different to the original, what with the entirely new take on Deseto, but that isn't to say that tense moments or jump scares don't happen. I would argue that their infrequency helps them stand out. I can't deny, however, that if you want to be utterly terrified, then this isn't going to be the one to do that. If you aren't one to usually play these kinds of games, this may be the perfect game for reluctant horror fans. Like its predecessor was over 30 years ago, it's a great introduction to ease you into the genre. Moving on to the game itself, minute-to-minute gameplay has its ebbs and flows. To start, there are no innovative systems like in AITD 2008, no non-linearity like in the original, no wild mechanics and plot points like in 2 and 3. Even the new Nightmare, for how closely it followed the Resident Evil formula of the time, did generally inventive things. Comparatively then, AITD 24 is one of the safest Alone in the Dark releases. It isn't trying to reinvent the wheel. That may be part of the reason why it's reviewed so mediocrely. People expect more from this series, even if it does often backfire epically. Solving the mystery of the story is at the heart of the gameplay. After all, that's what the protagonists are here to do. When we first start in the garage, a returning fan like myself expects the house to be haunted and is waiting for our first enemy reveal or jump scare. A new player will likely have the same belief from the game art. Pieces lean into that, easing us into Deseto, even faking out a jump scare with a cat in a barrel. Testing if we're a Doctor Who fan with an ominously placed garden statue, introducing a lumbering tree in the observatory that will widen the eyes of any AITD 92 player, even more so when they hear the voices that surround it.
Huh? What?
Tension rises as we walk into a dimly lit basement, all the while building a mental picture of the puzzles we'll have to come back to solve. Creeping into the house, by this point I was sure a zombie would be entering from behind me at any moment. Every time you access a room, the door will ominously creak and close, just as it did in the original, with an echoing thud of it slamming shut. From a technical standpoint, this is just a means of culling assets, and before the patches, each door opening was greeted with that awful stutter, sullying the moment a tad. Even if it can be explained by a draft in-world, it's a menacing occurrence regardless. Wandering into the front foyer to let in our contemporary, Emily if you're playing as Edward or vice versa, we're soon greeted by the residents of Deseto, and that slowly rising tension is slashed in half by a knife to reveal this location as the safe space I've explained. This is where I believe many bounced off the game, as their expectations were subverted and not in the way they wanted. This is where the moniker as a reimagining is so important. I too was taken aback, but over time I came to appreciate what the developers were trying to do with this change, and it helps that their passion for this series crops up time and time again, like iconic items strewn about for fans to discover, direct Easter egg references to events from the 90s series, meta callbacks from a specific character, or even how the player moves. We walk and run slowly, just as in AITD 92. Even Edward's run is directly inspired by the awkward run that Frederic Renal influenced from his office antics. With these slow, deliberate movements, controls are hit and miss. The numpad and the arrow keys are bound to move in the camera by default, which means the game can be entirely played using only the keyboard, just like the old school methods of game control from the pre-mouse era. I really enjoyed playing around with this. Still, I'm not one to sacrifice my aiming in the long haul, so I quickly returned to using the mouse. Due to the controls reflecting the number of buttons on a controller, while you can map the weapons to number keys 1, 2 and 3, the fourth and last weapon you find can only be accessed by holding down 1 instead of just pressing 4. Generally, the controls and movement are admittedly a bit clunky, yet I don't see them as feeling too bad for the game they've been designed for. You can't spin on a dime, and if an action game controlled like this, I too would complain, but this isn't an action game, so much as a survival horror game that at times may have some action. Tank controls are even more sluggish, and I've already argued how they add to a game's horror rather than detract from it, by how they increase difficulty. Think of a nightmare you've had, where your punches are slow and you can't outrun the monsters chasing you. That's what makes those scenarios scary, and that's how Alone in the Dark controls. You can't outwit the enemy with pro gamer moves, slide cancelling around them. You're a vulnerable bloke or gal well out of their element. Fair enough, on release the dodge mechanic was broken, lurching the player towards the enemy instead of in the direction they were pointing. Now that this has been fixed though, the mechanic works as what I must believe was intended, where again this isn't something like Elden Ring. The dodge isn't giving you iframes as you run circles around the baddies, it allows you to lunge out of the way to get a little distance, given enough time to turn around and fight back. Regardless of my defense, combat is undercooked. Following the original, there's a mix of guns and melee weapons to choose from, with melee relying on timing. Yet animations clipping through each other, and combat scenarios often taking place in rooms too claustrophobic for these animations to play out properly, leads to it looking quite haphazard as you can't effectively get any combos going. Shooting is very basic as well. You can't run and gun as your accuracy is greatly dependent on standing still, with recoil, especially on Combi's revolver, being quite strong. For me, that is evoking AITD 92 to a T. Animations were slow and awkward there too, requiring a literal wind-up timer before the action was performed. Did it feel weird? For sure, but it added to how the combat worked. It had a very heavy learning curve, but the accomplishment when you mastered it felt great. AITD 24 doesn't quite nail it in that regard. Combat isn't hard, guns are more than enough to blast your way through the game, with melee as a last resort. I'd call it acceptable, not necessarily detracting from the game, but it doesn't add to it, it's just there. Still, combat isn't a huge part of the game. Fights can be solved with a swift shotgun spread or two, and by the time you get your hands on the Tommy gun, it isn't much of a worry at all. For melee, there is a wide variety, but no dramatic difference between the options other than common sense, like sledgehammers hitting a little harder. And even that's not verified, it might just be subjective. It's so close to being good, there are a few encounters where you're juggling melee, throwing molotovs on the floor, shooting at range and dodging attacks. In those rare situations, it all comes together in a satisfying way. The rest just boils down to plinking enemies hobbling towards you at a snail's pace. What is frustrating is the lack of fallback options. Ammo isn't really that scarce as long as you're exploring and checking every container you come across. When you do run out though, you better hope your melee weapon is sufficient. Just as in AITD 92, melee weapons can break, but if that happens in the original, you can resort to some classic rough and tumble, karate kicking and headbutting your way to victory. Here you're left with nothing but running and hoping you can find a throwable item or some ammo. Combat can't be left by outrunning the enemy or hiding either, as they'll always stay on high alert. This can lead to annoying scenarios where you're trapped in a corner and keep getting stun-locked, unable to dodge and run away. Death isn't the be-all and end-all, autosave checkpoints are placed often enough that I never lost more than 5 minutes of progress, and if it did happen, it was a learning experience where I had to better prepare and not get myself stuck in a corner. If you're expecting the action to be on the same level as games like Alan Wake 2, you'll be left sorely disappointed, but it's really not that terrible. Between the two characters, subjectively from playing the game and analysing my footage, it appears that Emily runs a bit faster, and the biggest gameplay change between the two is their choice of gun. Combi's revolver can take down a basic vine zombie with 2 headshots or 3 shots to the body, while Emily's Colt takes an extra bullet each. This is balanced by her faster reload, letting us unload more lead down range, although I found that it inadvertently made Emily the harder option for combat due to her decreased damage. Combined with the ammo scarcity, while playing Emily, I had to fall back onto the lackluster melee system more often, or worse, resort to stealth. Stealth cannot be defended. It's poorly implemented and barely worth interacting with. It seems to be inspired by The Last of Us, even down to the clicker-style enemy design. The AI is not in a position to come out favourably in that comparison, being so dumb that the stealth is laughably easy or at times broken. Some of the monsters are blind, the intention being that you can lure them away from the direction you need to go by throwing an object. This whole sound mechanic doesn't play out. Either they don't respond to the sound at all, or walk over there for a second before returning to their default patrol cycle. With enough trial and error, it's possible to get it working, but when a few shots to the head can give the same result, I rarely found myself compelled to take a stealthy approach, as the odds were never stacked so much against my favour that it would be beneficial to do so. The throw mechanics that are intrinsic to the stealth system are not sophisticated enough to carry it either. Throwables cannot be stored, forcing you to throw them upon picking them up, and the visual arc shown is not accurate. Needless to say, failing a stealth sequence due to incompetence is fine, but failing it due to an unreliable visual indicator does not feel earned. The only time where stealth does work is when the level has been designed so linearly that it's a no-brainer, like zombies being placed in a sewerway. As long as you don't run and make too much noise, they won't be aware of you. Outside of these presented on a silver platter conditions, engaging with stealth was more frustrating than it was worth. And again, combat is simple enough and ammo abundant enough that stealth is truly the most optional I have seen it in a survival horror game for quite a while. I must admit though, while probably not intentional, this is inadvertently emulating AITD 92. Stealth didn't even exist in that game, and combat was the go-to method. Fortunately, action is but a minor part of the game. The majority of the playthrough is spent exploring and puzzle solving. Exploring Deseto can be generally thrilling, but there's a big caveat. While it tries to emulate a non-linear game, where we are free to unlock the manor at our own pace, just as in the original, this is a linear game broken up into 5 chapters. Each chapter introduces new items that unlock more of the house, harkening back to how players moved their way through Deseto in 1992, but without any of the freedom that free-form nature facilitated. Most egregious of all is how at some point certain areas of the house will be artificially closed, blocked with assorted household items. I don't mind them locking off new areas for later chapters, but removing previous ones ruins the openness of the game. A shortcut I made by pushing this ladder against a balcony had been blocked off in a later chapter, for example. It hurts the player's knowledge of the house. Why take the time to learn the layout if it's not going to help you later anyway? Lore-wise, it's not out of the realm of possibility that Mrs. Thompson, the disgruntled maid character, could move these blockages as time passes. Indeed, she has a direct incentive to impede our investigation. But that's still a thin veil for what is a game design decision to tell the story in a more linear fashion. For the sake of understandability, that may be for the best. Compiling all of the books in AITD 92 to grasp the story could be overwhelming, and I wouldn't be surprised to find if most people never formed a clear picture of that game's storyline because of that. That doesn't change though how the interest in exploration and overall replayability is stifled by linearity, removing that excitement in the original that came with advancing the game far faster than intended, skipping entire sections as you beeline to destroy Prext in the tunnel down below. The Seto mansion itself is extremely well modelled and oozes noir Great Depression style. It doesn't remake the original De Seto, taking on a slightly more accurate architectural layout to how manor houses of the 1800s would have been. From the grand family estates around Wales and the UK that I visited, AITD24's imagining is closer to reality, like having the kitchen in the basement and the serving quarters pushed off to the side. An advancement from the 90s series is how locating and picking up objects is handled. As you walk near an interactable entity, a small white circle will highlight it for you. This streamlines the process massively from hitting the use key as you slide around every desk and bookshelf hoping to find something of interest. The quality of life is undeniable. Maybe I'm just nostalgic, but I kind of like games that require you to look at and activate everything. It feels like it forces you to explore. When you're looking at these circles, there's no point looking closely at anything interesting because the game highlights every object for you. Perhaps an optional toggle for the feature would be the best of both worlds. The world is intricately designed enough that imploring the player to look at their surroundings more closely isn't a detriment, and the puzzle items are placed in a way that they could be found naturally. The problem is exacerbated by the many collectibles scattered throughout the game world. A source of additional lore, Easter egg cutscenes and weapon unlocks, the lagging apps act as a motivational design choice to push the player towards exploring and playing a second playthrough. Due to certain collectibles being locked to each playable character, if you wish to fully complete the game, you'll have to experience both sides of the story. Promoting exploration like this does seem to be at odds with those white circles, as they take away immersion, placing the player in an obstinate state of mind. Whenever we enter a new room, it becomes second nature to run a quick lap while keeping an eye out for UI cues, rather than entering a new room urging us to breathe in the surroundings and come up with a plan on how to proceed ourselves. Not to mention the sometimes nonsensical placement of resources. Yeah, there's bullets in the fridge. Yeah, of course there are. Why wouldn't there be bullets in the fridge? The puzzles continue this game's trend of being a mixed bag. The 90s series had its fair share of cryptic puzzles that required a lot of trial and error, and even a cursory look at a guide if you were lucky enough to play them after the internet became more widespread. AITD24 doesn't repeat this, keeping the puzzles relatively simple and overwhelmingly logic-based. There will be times you'll have to find sequences or do a little code breaking. Convenience though is what simplifies them too much. All you really need to do is find the clue, guaranteed to be in the same room or previously picked up on the linear journey to the puzzle's location. There was rarely an occasion where a puzzle would tantalize, requiring the player to come back at a later time when they understood it better. When it does happen, like with a globe requiring a specific key piece, there isn't actually a puzzle. Once the key piece is found by continuing to play the game, you can return to unlock the globe, more a test of your memory than a brain teaser. Many of the obstacles suffer from this, where they seem intended to be puzzles before being negated by having the needed item placed within reaching distance, like an electrical switch needed to fix a fuse box lying on an adjacent shelf, or a key for a door conveniently hidden in the same room. Had the HUD not had those white circles, this may have still been a little cryptic, which does lead me to believe that the decision to add these circles may have been later in development than the level design. Backtracking thankfully is mitigated by the brilliant Resident Evil 4-esque map, which not only depicts where you have and haven't been yet, but also shows if you've missed any items, found a key to a previously locked door, or uncovered a clue that means you can now complete a puzzle that was previously off limits to you. While this does make the game even easier, De Seto is much bigger than it was in 1992, and as our time in the manor is lessened by the exterior sequences, I was appreciative of the map to help get my bearings. The puzzles can often feel contrived and disconnected from the overarching story too. For instance, one puzzle involved deciphering a combination padlock by arranging medicine bottles in a specific order based on a pattern of rot growing over them. This isn't hard, it just strains believability. Why would anyone secure a padlock with a code derived this way? And worse is how an object used to solve a simple puzzle cannot be used elsewhere. Like these bolt cutters used to open a shed suddenly disappear and can't be used again in situations that could be solved by it. There are interesting puzzles where you have to solve a sliding picture or use a rotating talisman to transfer yourself between reality and Jeremy's world. Fun little brain teasers to help break up the pace. They are few and far between.
Oh wow, I can't believe I guessed the combination. I must be some kind of genius.
I do love that the game acknowledges if we solve a puzzle way earlier than we should be able to though. Little meta nods to using a guide or replaying the game always get a kick out of me. My theory is that the weak puzzles and mediocre combat are partially a result of the almost impossible situation Pieces Interactive found themselves in. They wanted to renew a classic of the survival horror genre, appealing to those classic fans while also welcoming newer horror fans into the mix. Hence the higher action stakes, over-the-shoulder camera, and unconvoluted puzzles that can be made even easier using a so-called modern mode that highlights clues in the notes for you. In trying to please both distinct groups, the final product doesn't entirely please anyone. Older fans will be turned off by the streamlining, and new fans will expect something more advanced or faster paced in the action department. For me, they mitigated these failures somewhat with passion, intrigue and world design, crazy writing, and homages galore, but the point stands that they couldn't please everybody and probably shouldn't have tried to. The story is the saving grace, taking the elements of AITD 92, the direct Lovecraftian references, key plot points and characters, and then shifting them on their head, reworking and rewriting them into a faster paced, thrilling plot that kept me intrigued throughout and had me chomping at the bit to start a second playthrough to learn every little detail and ensure I had fully grasped Mikhail Hedberg's organised chaos. Perhaps it was because I adored the original story so much, or due to my adolescent fandom of Lovecraft. For me, Hedberg's writing here is up there with his previous works. Not everyone agrees, and I can understand some of their reasons. The story is not so much told as it is scattered through the game across a myriad of sources. Learn one to uncover its facets and piece it together themselves. The game's grandest puzzle is its story itself. Lore items dropped in the world, narrated insights into the PC's thought process after each progression, and often vague cutscenes and conversations that benefit from 2 playthroughs to see every angle. It's not an easy storyline to understand from a casual playthrough. Just as with AITD 92, one must take the time to solve this puzzle. Each time I thought I was on the right track, I was surprised to be sidelined by another unexpected turn of events. Part of my surprise with the story could be due to incorrect expectations. Throughout, I was expecting the return of the villain from the original, making assumptions and jumping to conclusions that would be proven incorrect, which perhaps made the story a more exciting experience for me than someone entirely fresh to the series. And I can't help but wonder about how confusing this game may be for those not well versed in its references, both to the Alone in the Dark games of old, as well as all Lovecraft and other cosmic horror concepts. Indeed, many of the critiques of the story I have seen generally are due to a lack of familiarity with Lovecraftian horror. Those familiar with cosmic horror will recognize story beats from other stories, as AITD 24 nods to Lovecraftian tropes that will simply go over the head of those not well read in the iconic horror writer's body of work. For example, Games Radar felt the story was nonsensical and lacking clear descriptions, seemingly unaware of the fact that this is exactly what cosmic horror revels in. The blanks are there to be filled by our imaginations, in the hopes that our thoughts will be more terrifying than any 4K graphical interpretation could be. Those exact trappings of this specific type of horror is what harms some of the designs for me. In written word, they benefit from vague descriptions and the reader's overactive imagination, not so when they are placed straight in front of you. AITD 92 only got away with this due to the abstraction of its polygonal graphic style, and a reliance on the reader's mind to do some of the heavy lifting does become a convenient means for waving away minor plot holes. To some degree, Lovecraftian works implore headcanon, or at least a willingness to fill these gaps. Perhaps then it is unfair to overlook how confusing the game may be to those unfamiliar with the category. Those narrations of the PC's thoughts that I mentioned almost act like a novel being written as we play, providing a recap of everything that has happened and some insight into the minds of Emily and Combi. These I believe will serve really well for players who stopped halfway through a playthrough before returning sometime later, keeping them caught up with what had recently happened in the story and ease them back into the game. While I won't be covering the story too in depth, the next section will contain spoilers. Skip to the timecode on screen if you wish to avoid them. Following our introduction to some of the residents and staff of Deseto, the protagonist duo proceeds to Jeremy's residence, a small room off of one of the corridors. At the crest of the stairwell stands some of the tormented man's artwork. Making Jeremy a sculpturist rather than just a painter helps tremendously in keeping him at the forefront of the player's mind. We'll have to pass these statues on a frequent basis, and their eldritch nature need not be stated. I found that I generally walked past Hartwood's paintings in the original and didn't absorb them as much as I should have until I came to actually making a retrospective. Here though, you can't help but notice his warped sense of the world. Exploring his room and looking into his haunted eyes for a self-portrait allows that whom which possesses him to enter our minds too. From this point onwards, we are able to enter Jeremy's world, as we do so immediately, entering a memory of New Orleans. The enigmatic figure of Jeremy Hartwood takes center stage throughout the narrative, his cryptic journals and eerie headspaces leading us on a journey into the unknown. Transitioning between realities becomes pivotal, as the blurring of the boundaries between the tangible worlds of Deseto and the nightmarish realms grows. Jeremy's world can be deliberately accessed by a mysterious talisman we find left for us. The staff of Deseto are looking for Jeremy, and they too have the means of travelling into the crevices of his mind. Unusually, they do not seem to be as confused as our main characters. The story shines best when played through the eyes of both characters, as their interactions with NPCs are unique, and a whole section of Chapter 4 is exclusive to either Combi or Emily too. Emily is written to be a lot more in the know of Jeremy's condition and what it entails, often going headstrong to the otherworldly situations the player finds themselves in. She has past relationships with some of the staff, which changes our perception of them too, as well as some of the characters being far more aggressive and dismissive to the young woman, especially Dr. Gray, and lore beats are dropped far earlier in her playthrough, such as a heavenly location known as Tower Ella being mentioned with no explanation in Chapter 2. This is what I think led to the confusion some had with the story, dropping them into the deep end of a world they don't understand and their questions not being answered until much later. Having played Edward first, his fish out of water experience mirrored my own, and I found that we shared many of the same questions of the world around us, which were then promptly answered in a note, cutscene or narration. That said, the complete story requires Emily's more inquisitive dialogue and deeper connection to the narrative to understand everything. Yet I feel that Edward's perspective too is required to introduce us to the craziness of Jeremy's possession, something Emily is already well versed in and doesn't seem too concerned about. In some regards then, playing Emily second is kind of a meta-narrative on the story, as Emily knows as much as the player does from their first playthrough as Combi, except of course for story beats that are yet to happen to her. One issue I found is that certain characters have their personalities and traits much better developed playing as Emily than as Edward. Grace, a little girl pulled straight from Alone in the Dark 2, plays a pivotal role in Combi's unique Chapter 4 section, as well as with the ending reveal twist which should shock the player, yet it failed to do so for me as the child's, let's say, odd nature hadn't been fully explored in Edward's cutscenes. Really then, playing Emily first has its merits for how better involved and immersed into the world she is. Edward's candidness and sometimes woeful investigation skills, despite his job title, can lead to some confusion with the story due to how he reacts to it. This is explained by Combi's life as a functional alcoholic with a poor memory, whose main character trait is that he's fearful of losing his mind as he drinks to forget traumatic moments in his past, moments he will be forced to face on his journey. This trait leads to him ignoring the craziness in front of his eyes, and ignoring to mention what is happening to him in hopes that others don't raise concerns about his own faculties. His conversations then tonally whiplash the player as we transition from running for our lives in a haunted forest into a doctor's office, where Edward bottles up what had just happened. Comically at times too, as the game fails to wipe away the blood that builds up on the character model throughout the previous action sequences, leading to cutscenes where people are entirely unaware of what a terrible state we are in. A reveal later on that questions the player character's own sanity before the start of the game can be used to explain why staff might not mention this sorry state. It's minor plot points like that, some that are barely mentioned again, that can be used to fill any gap you may have. It seems to be one of those factors that you either see as a brilliant means of employing the player's imagination, or a frustrating method of waving away any questions. Nyarlathotep, ripped straight from the Lovecraft short story of the same name, takes on the role as the main antagonist and the mantle of the Dark Man, nodding to the alias of the original game's antagonist, Elijah Pickford. The Dark Man is no longer the black magic wielding pirate, but an ancient Egyptian pharaoh who travels the world as a magician displaying his powers. He enters the United States in a story similar to Bram Stoker's Dracula, locked in a sarcophagus on a boat transported by the Prext shipping company, where he wipes out all those within. Prext of course being another reference to AITD 92's adversary. As with the narrator in Lovecraft's short story, Jeremy visited one of Nyarlathotep's shows, only for the outer god to latch onto the unwilling artist with the age-old goal of using him in order to unleash darkness and chaos upon the world. Jeremy was an avid reader and had made the mistake of reading more than he should have, uncovering dark magic and cultish writings that infected his soul. The Dark Man saw this in Heartwood and haunts him to extract this knowledge. Heartwood battles the demonic pharaoh in his mind, conjuring memories from his life and from the wealth of books he has consumed to keep the Dark Man at bay. These mental battles caused Jeremy's paranoia and his subsequent admittance to Deseto, but it wasn't mere happenstance. Some of those in the world are aware of the power of the outer gods and hope to summon Shub-Niggurath to Earth. Not the only Cthulhu mythos reference, who else but the Black Goat cult would be the ones aiming to surrect the perverted fertility goddess? The staff and residents of Deseto make up said members of this cult. Like Nyarlathotep, they too need the hidden knowledge in Jeremy's mind, the evil phrases that will allow them to successfully complete their ritual. Jeremy hopes to use the Dark Man to stop this ritual, fighting fire with fire and swearing over his soul in exchange for preventing the cult from finding the phrases. Not all is as it seems, however, and events throughout the game leave much of this up to interpretation. Is Nyarlathotep real, or a trick played by the cult? Is Jeremy really possessed, or a deeply troubled man battling a brain tumor? Is Combi the good guy who will extract evil from Jeremy and destroy the cult, or actually a member, a sleeper agent seeking to extract the knowledge himself? With 5 endings, 2 good, 2 evil, and an additional completionist ending that may or may not be the perfect ending, there is a lot more to discover here than I thought when I first received the code. Especially as the adventure has us whisked across the world, even into an Egyptian tomb. At times it's hard to believe you're even playing the same game anymore. I fell in love with the adventure of it all. This couldn't be further from the condensed, claustrophobic haunted house of AITD 92, but after some time, I was all for it. I didn't expect an Indiana Jones game, that's for sure. A point raised by reviewer Matt S. on digitallydownloaded.net rings very true, regarding an often cited quote from Stephen King about the 3 types of terror. The gross out, like the sight of a severed head tumbling down a flight of stairs. The horror, such as the unnatural, spiders the size of bears and the dead waking up and walking around. And terror, when you come home and notice everything you own has been taken away and replaced by an exact substitute. When the lights go out and you feel something behind you, but when you turn around, there's nothing there. What King's talking about is really not that much different to the old truism about storytelling, that it's better to show than tell. As graphical capabilities have improved, developers have resorted to showing the player everything. Previously, technical limitations forced developers to engage the mind and imagination to get players to fill in the blanks. Now they can spell out everything, in extreme detail. It's often visceral and effective on that level, but horror games are rarely elevated to King's description of terror. AITD 24 tries its best and gets closer than a lot of its contemporaries, but does ultimately fail. Between the enemy designs and the grand reveal of the game's big bad, it never reaches that height in a way that AITD 92 did, or at least got closer to. I won't ignore that a pirate doesn't meet the criteria either, but a withered low-res husk in a tree, ambiguous art and lore books did help it get nearer than this latest iteration. The story is engaging, if a bit confusing, and depending on which endings you get, it likely won't offer the kind of closure that some people want. However, that is pretty standard for Lovecraftian narratives. It's better to enjoy the ride, not worry so much about the destination. The problem with those endings is how they're achieved. Instead of the game taking note of any choices you make throughout that may dictate the direction you're going, they literally boil down to a quick mouse movement and button press during the penultimate cutscene. In a moment of gameplay so brief that I would have never noticed it had it not been for the help of an online guide. There's nothing to indicate that there was a choice to be made here, which makes me wonder if the devs just hoped for news to get around as it did. Either way, how the game ends drastically alters the outcome, with the conclusion being that whichever ending is canon for you is up to your own interpretation of the story itself. A rare insight that not many narrative-driven games take advantage of. With the Lovecraftian subject matter, AITD24 takes full advantage of its inspiration. Stuck Between Worlds, Alone in the Dark tries to pay homage to a 32-year-old game while maintaining the expectation of the modern genre. It may not please many fans of the recent titles in said genre due to its lackluster combat or cosmic horror story, but those homages alone tell me just how passionate Pieces Interactive were for the birth of this series. The following is a compilation of all the references that I found, not including the ones already mentioned in this review, and I'm sure I missed far more. If you thought that this game didn't pay respect to the classic trilogy, I would have to vehemently disagree. The Astarte, Prext's old pirate ship, has been rewritten as an explorer's ship, referenced in paintings and some lore writings. Some of those on board share names with the characters from AITD92, including good old Keith. Under a large barrel in the basement, scratch marks can be found. In the original, a hole behind the barrel leads into underground tunnels filled with monsters. Jeremy Hartwood's father was said to have died in these tunnels, his fingernails torn and bloody from scrabbling at the floor. There's an Easter egg sound effect of Jeremy hanging himself when you get close to the attic door for the first time. Similarly, finding a particular set of Laganaps will unlock this touching, if not on the nose, cutscene.
I'm sorry, Frederick.
Those Laganaps too are direct references. Grace is the main character of 1993's Jack in the Dark demo, and she references the maze and pirates of the direct sequel in the perfect ending. Juan Luis Jorge sits on a tree in the position Prext was trapped in the original. The Darkman takes on the role of the floating pixel monster known as the Vagabond in the library, chasing you as you try to pass through. When you first open a long corridor downstairs, the camera moves so as to set up the boss battle with the pirate version of Ezekiel Prext. On the steamboat in Chapter 3, there's a reference to the record music you must collect and use to solve a few puzzles in AITD 92. Later in the game, as you break into Dr. Gray's office, the camera takes on a traditional pre-rendered camera angle. It's interesting how this entire section is using this locked third-person camera. One could speculate that it may have been an intention at one point in the development to have the game play like this, and with the DLC filters and character models turned on, you could convince someone that this was a screenshot from the original game. However, the controls here are janky as they're not tank controls, trying instead to translate the behind-the-shoulder controls onto this camera angle, feeling awkward as a result. Those DLC cinematic filters and the skins obviously pay direct homage, but are not worth any amount of money. I'm only using them because they came free with my review code. Charging money for these is very egregious. A few filters and character models should have been included for everyone. It's disappointing to see this practice here. To conclude, birthed as a pioneer and since spending decades chasing its contemporaries' trends to become a pale imitation of other better ideas, Alone in the Dark 2024 may not achieve perfection, but its compelling story, immersive world-building, comfort in providing a sincere atmosphere, and nods to the franchise's heritage left a positive impression. It's still not innovative or original, but the fact that Pieces Interactive give players the time to linger rather than bombard us with constant scares demonstrates a level of confidence that many modern horror games lack. It's just a shame that the weaker aspects of the gameplay let it down. The game is quite short and doesn't overstay its welcome. I finished my first playthrough in 7 hours, leaving me wanting more. The second playthrough allowed me to hit 100% completion for an additional 5 hours of playtime. In an age where games are often bloated with busy work, AITD24 was a refreshing breath of air. As it stands for this new entry, now that most of the bugs are fixed, if you are still interested after this review, I happily recommend the game, although the current £50 price tag is a little steep. A few story threads are left dangling, and I hoped that Alone in the Dark 2024 performed well enough to earn the green light for some sequels of a similar mould. With tweaks to the stealth and combat system, I would have been very on board for that. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to have been the case, and it's likely that the curse continues. Another reboot, another dead series killed before it could begin. Alone in the Dark is doomed to repeat history. Thanks for watching, and a big thank you to all of my Patreon and YouTube members. N. Makoma asks, what games had the biggest impact on you growing up? Unironically, Spyro 2 Gateway to Glimmer. I will not accept any Ripto's Rage slander. It will always be GTG to me. And why? Well, it's the game that turned me into a gamer and not just a kid who casually played some games here and there. Since then, it has been my biggest hobby.